Before the advent of industrialization, women were often tasked with traditional jobs such as making clothing. Women would also manage the affairs of the farm and raising children. However, the traditional role for women began to change as the Industrial Revolution unfolded. Women entered the workforce in textile mills and coal mines in order to help support their families since working class people received a low level of pay. Women were not valued the same as men in the workplace. While male British industrial workers were often paid about 10 shillings per week, women were paid half that. Along with poor pay, women were also subjected to horrible conditions in the workplace. For example, a common job for women in a coal mine was to hold carts attached to her waist of coal up mine shafts through a narrow space. The work was tiring and dangerous. At the same time that women were entering the workforce, socialist values were emerging in the Industrial Revolution, as workers began to protest and fight for more equal rights. The early feminist movements also emerged out as women began to organize and protest for more equality in society. Feminism is the name for the movement of women's rights that sought equality with men. The early feminist movements particularly fought for workplace equality, but first needed to achieve equal voting rights. As such, one of the first things that women began to fight for was the right to vote. Throughout the 1800s, women were denied the right to vote, but this changed in most industrial societies in the early 1900s, as the governments began to extend rights to women. This movement for equality in voting rights is often referred to as the suffrage movement. On 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention takes place in New York. A declaration of sentiments is signed. A set of 12 resolutions is adopted calling for equal treatment of women and men under the law and voting rights for women. On 1850, local and national women's rights conventions are held. The suffrage leaders discuss both abolition and women's rights issues. In 1851, Sojourner Truth gives her famous "Ain't I a Woman" argument. Concern grows over wording of the proposed 14th Amendment, which would put the word male into the U.S. Constitution. On 1859, when assembled at Wyandotte to draw up a state constitution, Clarina Nichols, a recognized leader in the women's rights movement, presents a petition calling for equal political and civil rights for Kansas women. 1909, the women working in the International Garment Workers Union went on a 14-week strike against the factories in order to receive shorter hours, better pay, and better working conditions. 1920, the 19th Amendment guarantees all American women the right to vote. In the mid-19th century, several generations of women suffrage supporters lectured, wrote, and practiced civil disobedience to achieve what many Americans consider a radical change of the Constitution, the right to vote. The events that took place during that time are the precedent today in the fight for equal recognition of women and the abolition of gender discrimination. According to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights, regardless of their sex, and everyone is entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. As we could observe, the reality of women during the Industrial Revolution was far from gender equality, and they didn't even have rights to anything. As we talked in class, in 1789, the Declaration of Rights of the Man and of the Citizen were intended to protect only men, despite it was proclaimed 20 years after the Industrial Revolution had started. Just in its first article, it read, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights." As the Encyclopedia Britannica states, it reflected the interest of the elite and, of course, of men. The rights contained in the Declaration were only awarded to men. The fight for gender equality has been a long and a tough one. Since, as we reviewed in class, history has always been dominated by men and shadowed women, making them look weaker and incapable of doing the same tasks at the same level of performance as men. Though this ideology has changed through the years, there is still a long way to go. Now take a look at these outrageous facts presented by the World Economic Forum in 2019. The 19th Amendment and the movement itself did not end discrimination against women in education and employment. Although women could vote, they very rarely held public office. Women continued to be underrepresented in the professions and relatively few sought advanced degrees. Until the mid-20th century, the ideal in U.S. society was typically for women to marry, have children, and become housewives. Those who sought to work for pay outside the home were routinely denied jobs because of their sex, and when they did find employment, were paid less than men. Nevertheless, nowadays women are still fighting for more equal rights since they continue to be underrepresented in some jobs. Women earn less money than men for the same work. As of 2014, fully employed women earn 79 cents for every dollar earned by a fully employed man.